Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Lesson 4. And let's see, we're going to talk about the Jews in the Mediterranean world. So, if you remember from when we left off, we said that the Jews, who remember, were from Judah and they had been under Persian rule. And so they're under Persian rule for about 200 years. And then a new king of Macedonia, Alexander, or later called Alexander the Great, Alexander, the king of Macedonia, he comes in and conquers, um, and he takes over. He has been conquering quite a bit of land. We'll talk about him more later. But he conquered Greece. He greatly admires Greece, and he wants to spread all of the Greek ideas. So you see a lot of that in his um, empire that he's going to build. Um, so the reason we're talking about that here is that when they come in and they conquer the Persians and then take over, they allow the Jews to stay. So different than other previous groups that came in and forced them to leave, right? Well, the Alexander the Great lets them stay in Judah. Now, of course, they're still ruled by outside influences, but they stay, and because of that, and because he wants to spread Greek ideas, the language and the culture of Greece also spreads to this region. And because of that, we get a Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, is that the reason that's important is because now you get Hebrew ideas, or the Jewish faith, right, is going to be able to spread to more people because now it is in Greek and more people can understand it and read it. So the religion is going to spread. All right. And so the other reason that their religion spread so widely, even though they weren't that big of a group of people, is because they had been cast out previously, and not everyone moved back. So there are now Jews scattered around, and so that idea is called the diaspora, a group which literally means scattered. So the Jews that are scattered throughout. And they're not only living in the Jewish homeland, yet they're still practicing the Jewish faith. Okay, and so they stayed loyal to their religion, and therefore it is going to spread throughout the region. Okay, and so with the help of the Greek language and them being living in all different places, that is one of the reasons why the Jewish faith spread so widely. All right, so after a while, new kingdoms come in this area. So after after Alexander's death, his four generals decide that they're going to split up the empire and each take a piece. And so, of course, Judah is the Seleucid king in this area. The Seleucids are the family that have the kingdom that is in all of Southwest Asia, and so Judah is going to be under their control. Okay, and so Antiochus the Fourth, his name is Antiochus. He, you know, he's like many of the previous rulers, where he believes that the Greek gods and goddesses are the correct ones, and so he requires everyone in his kingdom to worship them. And of course, the Jews are not going to be willing to do that, right? God's major commandment was that there was only one God, and you shouldn't bow to false idols and all those things. So the Jews are going to have a major problem with this. So there are some people who decide they're not going to stand for it, and basically the short story is in 167, the Judas Maccabeus, or Judah, I've seen it spelled both ways, Judah Maccabeus. The Maccabees are his army that he builds, and they go out into the hillside, and they're determined to, rebel and have freedom of religion, and they have many battles. And the short story is that they eventually, the Maccabees, his followers, they eventually take back control of their temple. Who, the temple has been taken away from them. Remember how important the temple was to them, and that had been, you know used as a place to worship Greek gods instead. And so that's seen as like sacrilege, right? And when they did get this temple back under their control, they had to cleanse it and rededicate it to the rightful God, okay, and get rid of all those statues and everything. And so the cleansing, of course, is part of that celebration. And during this celebration of getting the temple back and rededicating it to God, is the story of the oil that they were going to burn, and they only had a little bit left that hadn't been consecrated by the the Greek hadn't used it all up. So the oil lasts for 8 nights. It's just considered a miracle because there should have only been enough for one. And so that's why the celebration of Hanukkah has the 8 nights of celebration and the 1 candle per night, right? But of course, back then it was the oil. I have an Ed puzzle all about Hanukkah to show you in a minute. Okay, the other thing is eventually the Romans are going to come in next. Okay, so it was around 100 BC or so that the Romans are starting to come in, and they're conquering and getting control of the Eastern Mediterranean lands. And so the Romans come in, and in 63 BC, they are going to actually conquer Judah. They are going to take it under their control. They actually rename it Judea. Similar, confusing for you, I know, a little bit. Okay, and they do let one of their own rule, though. Herod was a Jewish king. He was, of course, still had to, answer to the Romans, but he was Jewish and one of their own. And so he is allowed to rule. He has a lot of building. He did forts and cities and a lot of building projects under his rule. One of the other things he did is I'm going to call it renovating the Second Temple. It was kind of like rebuilding it. It was in disrepair over the years, and it was, he wanted to make it much, glorified. So it ends up like much bigger under when he rebuilding. So there he gets a lot of credit, Herod, for making this beautiful Second Temple much larger, and he included Greco-Roman architecture in it. It took about 10 years just to build it, but then it took another like 75 years to finally add all the finishing touches and decorations that were added to it. Okay, so unfortunately, after Herod's death, the officials in Rome started, getting, more restrictive, and Jews there did not appreciate Roman rule, and many were really not liking it and trying to disagree about how they should deal with the Romans. And also they're having disagreements about exactly how their religion should be practiced. So there are 4 main groups we need to talk about, okay? One of the groups is called the Pharisees, and the Pharisees had the support of the common people, the regular people. They taught in the synagogues, and they really centered their religion around family life and obeying the 10 Commandments. And there's basically 2 disagreements going on, not only about how to deal with the Romans, but also about should the rules for how to follow the religion just be what was literally written, right? Should you follow directly from the Torah, or is some of the procedures that they follow now that have not been written down but have been passed down throughout the generations by word of mouth, right? They call that oral rule. So there's written rule and then there's oral rule. So they actually are fine with both, okay? Now, some of the groups you'll notice are not okay with those unwritten interpretations that have been just through a word of mouth. Okay, and the other thing the Pharisees, their view of Romans is they don't like them, but they think you should resist their control by just rededicating yourself to this Torah's teaches and being like the best you can be despite the Romans, right? So not listening to what they want, staying to Roman Jewish faith, but not like actively working against them or being violent or anything. Okay. Now, the second group I want to talk about is the Sadducees. The Sadducees are made up of the wealthy, the noble families, and a lot of them, of course, because they have that money, they've become scribes and have the higher positions like priests. Okay, now this group rejects oral law, so they only think you should go by what was written down, and also they favor working with the Romans to keep peace. Now, of course, that kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you are wealthy and doing pretty well, you're okay with things. You don't want to risk it. You're not as unhappy as some other groups. So, maybe that seems logical that they would be more open to cooperating with the Romans. All right, the third group is Essenes. The Essenes actually went out into the desert. They're a group of priests who broke away from the temple priests, and they decide they're going to move out to the desert and they're going to rededicate themselves to God out there and not live in among the everyone else. They're going to wait for God to deliver them from the Romans. That's their idea of how to deal with the Romans. Okay, kind of separate themselves, dedicate them to studying and praying, but out in the desert. Okay, so they also believed in only the strict written interpretation of what to do. One of the famous things we have from the Essenes, we assume it was the Essenes, were something called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Part of where they moved, the Qumran Desert, is where they moved, and that is out near the Dead Sea. And in the desert, it was found in 1947 a bunch of scrolls that were rolled up and put into clay jars in a series of caves out in the desert. And you can see by the picture here what that might have looked like. And so we believe that the Essenes had some library. There's so many of these scrolls, and that maybe they tried to protect them, right, by hiding them in a cave. And they were a huge find for historians, right? Because we think that maybe it was part of this larger library, and now we have a lot of information about what was going on at the time. Really a good explanation of how Judaism is kind of being practiced differently depending on what group you belong to, and the different theories and what it was like to live during that Roman occupation. So it was really good information for historians. All right, so this last group, the fourth group, are the Zealots. And the Zealots, and I'm sure you've heard that word before, is a zealot is someone who is going to, in this case, they're going to use force. They wanted to revolt and overpower the Romans. And so they do eventually try to do that in AD 66. They temporarily do well. They do oust the small army that is in Jerusalem. But then, of course, the Romans aren't going to stand for that. And so they come back in with larger forces. And within 4 years, they have now taken back control of Jerusalem. And then, of course, now they're going to punish the Jews for revolting. They're going to kill many of them. They're going to force many of them to leave. They destroy the Second Temple as a punishment. And so right now you can see in this picture that's called the Western Wall. That's part of the original temple that's still standing. And it's famous. You can see by the crowds. It's a very sacred prayer spot that people go to pray, and they like to touch the wall, and they put sometimes they fold up little prayers and put it in the cracks of the wall. And so that was the last time that the temple survived. Okay. Now, they did try to revolt again. This sometimes they have multiple names. So Simon ben Kosoba is or he's sometimes called Bar Kochoba. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And he led a revolt a few years later. And again, same thing happens. The Romans don't stand for it. They crush the revolt and they kill him and more. So every time they try to revolt and get their homeland back, the Romans would put it down forcibly. And so after this next revolt, now the Romans have had it, right? And so they have a lot more restrictions. At this point, they're so tired of them revolting that they say, okay, fine, we're going to take Jerusalem away from you. Like basically, you can't come visit your holy city, and you have to live somewhere else. You can't live in Judea anymore. And they basically have Judea under their control, but no Jews are allowed to live there. Okay, and so that is a major punishment. In fact, they even renamed Judea Palestine, which Palestine, the word is like referring back to like the Philistines, who, if you remember, they were the original people that were living there that the Israelites had come in and fought with to get enough land for themselves. So maybe that is like an attempt to like wipe out the history of the Jews in that area, right? Minimize their identification with that land. We don't know like if they did it on purpose to kind of like hurt the Jews, or if it was just like it's not theirs anymore, going back to like what the area was originally called, because I had to call it something, right? So for whatever reason, they changed it to the name of Palestine, and that would be particularly hurtful since that's pretty much who their enemies were that they beat.